Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and in today's video, we are actually going to quilt. And of course, I'm going to talk about it because I have a lot to say. Now we are ready to go. So I have my quilt. It's all pinned up all over the whole place. And I'm going to start in the middle. Now, not in the middle of the quilt, but in the middle of the top row. And the reason for that is as you put the fabric through the machine, as you put your quilt sandwich through the machine, it is going to pull those layers of fabric, and it can kind of make the fabric crawl one direction. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in the center. We're going to do the whole seam, the length, top to bottom. Then we're going to come back and do right of center, and then we're going to come back and do left of center. And we're going to do that all the way across the whole quilt. And what that will do is as it pushes the fabric, it will push in the same direction. Those of us that sewed for years before we ever quilted, what you normally do in sewing is you just go one row and then you turn your fabric, make a right angle, turn it again, and so you're going down and back and down and back and down and back. Quilting is unique in that when you get to the end of the row, you stop, cut your threads, and go back to the top. Because otherwise, as it pulls the fabric one direction, if you go down and then back up, it will pull those two fabrics like this. And so in between the seams on the back, there will be angled fabric. So we want all of those fabrics to go the same way. Then you turn the quilt 90 degrees and you do the exact same thing. So it's always pushing the fabric just in the same direction until you have to do the opposing seams, and then it pushes it that direction. So it's going to push the fabric to the right for one side and to the bottom on the other side. So that is what our goal is. So here we go. Now, because I'm in the middle of my quilt, I've got some extra fabric over here, some extra quilt. And so I'm going to kind of loosely roll that up. And then on this side, I'm going to pile this up onto this table, because what we're trying to do is keep what's going through the machine at about your hand width distance. So your two hands and in the middle. We want this to be flat and smooth as it goes through. And the weight of the quilt, especially as you do this more and it's a bigger quilt, it will pull the whole quilt, and it's going to pull against the needle and against what the machine is trying to do. So the machine is trying to pull it through. If you've got a bed-size quilt and it's hanging off this edge, it's just going to tug, tug, tug and pull, and your machine's going to have to work harder, and your stitches are not going to be even or uniform, and your body is going to be tired so at the end of it. So we want to get some of that weight off of the edge. You can also put it in your lap, which I have a fair amount right here in my lap. And I'm going to turn this, roll this up. So as I push, well, not really pushing, as I guide the quilt through the machine, it's just going to slide. And away we go. Now I am using my hand over here and my hand over here. So there we go. And what I'm doing is I'm watching this little corner, and I'm just lining my seam, this seam right up along with that corner. When I first started quilting, I had no idea of the concept of stopping and resetting and stopping and resetting. And that is just a part of quilting. I was used to putting the fabric in the sewing machine and pushing the pedal to the metal. And this is not that kind of sewing. So what I'm trying to do is just, I'm letting the machine do the work, but I'm also kind of keeping that quilt sandwich flat and even across the part where it's going through the machine. And you can see me, I'm smoothing, I'm kind of, sometimes I've noticed that I will pull my two hands apart from each other. Not hard, just enough to keep that nice and flat. And it is slow going initially. When I do stop, I stop with the needle in, and I usually try to stop on a seam. So where my needle is right now is in a seam. And my thought there is, if when I start again, I'm a little bit off of where I was, it's not as obvious as it would be in the like dead middle of that dark block right there. If you do realize that you're starting to go slightly askew, you want to not make radical corrections. If you have just been slowly easing away from your mark, slowly ease back rather than trying to fix it in the moment, because that's where those kind of, you can actually see it. Now, we've had a little bit of our quilt go through now. So I'm going to take a second and I'm going to look at my stitches. That looks pretty good, actually, and that's a better pace for me than normal. So apparently I'm listening to myself. I'm going to recenter. Now the weight of my quilt is on the back side of my table, which is good because I can actually square it up. And as it pulls, as the weight pulls, it will kind of keep it straight. You can still keep that up on the table because there comes a point where it's so heavy, it's pulling that direction, which is not necessarily great either. Got a little ahead of myself there. Did you see it? All right, now in my peripheral vision, I see this pin coming up. And I'm like, oh boy. So before it gets to my walking foot, and what I'm actually going to do in this situation, because right now, since this is our very first row of stitches, I'm going to leave it in, but I'm going to turn it a different way. The pins are what provides stability. Well, the pins provide stability and keep all your pieces in place until you get enough seams, enough quilted stitches to hold it in place for itself. So now I'm just right here at the end. I'm keeping this nice and flat, or as flat as I can. Sometimes I'm going to stop right here and point this out. Sometimes you'll notice where you had your pin and the fabric, you can see it's actually pushing this fabric this direction, which is making like a pucker. We can do a couple of things about that. We can ignore that for now and just get through this seam. I can take this out at this point since I've stopped, kind of re-smooth it, make it flat, and put it back in, which is what I've obviously chosen to do. And that way that edge still has some stability with the pin, but it's not puckering around it. Now, you do not have to go all the way. You definitely have to go off the fabric. So I go a little bit into the batting and the backing, but you do not have to go all the way across. So now I'm going to the next row over. I'm lining up again my little point onto this seam, and I'm going to do that whole thing over again. This time a little bit faster, maybe. Let's get our quilt up here. It's a constant sort of negotiation between the machine pulling the fabric, you keeping the fabric, your quilt sandwich in line, and then getting out of position, recentering, and then going again. Now here's one of those times I'm coming up on a pin. I think I'm going to miss it. I am going to miss it, but I am going to turn it. So did you see me smooth that, straighten that back out? If you're like me and you like the touch of fabric, using gloves can be a little challenging because I do so much by feel. I do my nesting seams by feel. I like the way fabric feels. I'm looking ahead and going, I'm going to run over this pin. So while I'm stopped and talking, I'm going to move that pin over to the center and get it out of my way. So using gloves can be a little bit of an adjustment, but it really does help grip the fabric. And again, I see it bunching up, so I'm going to stop right on that seam. Going to straighten my quilt sandwich out again. Now, if you do not have this much clearance, this machine has it's kind of like a big open neck. You may have to get a little creative. You can roll this, you can kind of shove it through. As long as everything's pinned nice and tight, it shouldn't mess up your quilt, but you definitely want to think that through. So if you just don't have quite as much clearance, you may have to get a little creative. And again, another pin directly in my way. This one like very, almost ran out of time there. I think the next 4 pins are going to be directly in the way. Goodness gracious. Yet another pin. Some of my fabric choices, the white is pretty stout, but this fabric right here, this pale blue with the darker blue dots, and this really pale blue right here, and right here, they are very thin, just the nature of the fabric. And so I do think it's crawling a little bit. You may have noticed as you're watching this video that it's just kind of pulling and bunching. And I did not do a super duper ton of pins, and that, the more pins you have, the more stable it is. Also, I have handled this quilt sandwich so many times. I've moved it from room to room a lot. So, and I actually at one point hung it up behind me just to get it out of the way because it was right in the way. And I think sometimes when you do that, the fabric pulls down on it. So that may be part of that. All right, so I'm going to go a few stitches past, cut that. Now, what I will be doing for the next little while is I'm going to go, so that was to the left, then I'm going to go back to the right, and then to the left. So I'm going to go another column over and then another column over. So I'll do that whole thing that way, but I'm not going to do that on camera. Now what I'm going to do is I'm turning my quilt and I'm going to go from the side to the side now instead of from the top to the bottom. And again, best to start in the center. This time I'm going to do to the right just for the heck of it. And I'll just alternate back and forth. So let's do that real quick. So I'm just going to keep doing this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, either side. Now I'm going to turn my quilt back. In this particular pattern, it's kind of actually tricky to remember which way you started. If you wanted to just make a little mark so that you know, like this is the top. Because once you turn it several times, it's like, wait, which way did I start? And if you want to maintain that all going the same direction. I just noticed something and I want to stop and point it out. Right here, two things. Those stitches are very small compared to the ones that are further on down the line. Sometimes that will happen when the fabric is pulling, and so the weight of the fabric is, the weight of the quilt sandwich is pulling against the needle, and so it does more stitches per inch or per millimeter than it should. So that's probably I needed to push my fabric, my quilt sandwich up onto my table so that the machine wasn't working so hard. Second thing is, you can see this is the seam that I just came across and did sideways. Sometimes this will happen. You can see that little bulge / lip. So as it pulled the fabric, it kind of almost made a fold. And that would be minimized if I had more pins. It would also, I kind of rushed that section a little bit. So just, again, that slow pace. And you can kind of, as you feel the fabric shifting, you can kind of pull apart to keep it moving in the right direction. That, again, when we wash that, that will be a nothing. That will be a big nothing burger. But it does, you know, if you were taking this to a quilt show where they're looking at all the seams. So kind of two learning experiences right there on the same block. The weight of the quilt was probably pulling and the machine went da-da-da-da-da-da-da all in one little section until it freed up, and then it started doing the right size again. And then this one, I probably just rushed too much and that got folded over. So, all right, moving right along. Nothing like learning from the negative experiences as much as from the positive. And what a good lesson for me, even as I'm doing this, like even off camera, don't get in a rush. Just, it's worth it to take the time to do it right and to have those nice, even, steady stitches. And recenter often to keep that nice and flat and pretty. All right, so now I have done this row on the right side of the seam. So we have one on the left and one on the right. And I will keep doing that off camera so that you don't have to watch me for hours and hours. Finish this quilt. You do your thing. Go get it together. Go do it. We'll reconvene when most or all of it is done and talk about our next steps. All right. So when I left you, I was going to do my seam to the right, seam to the left, seam to the right, seam to the left, turn, do it all over again. And I have done that. I hope you have done that too. And so I hope you're right here with me with your quilt. And so I'm going to show you my progress. It's probably going to look very similar to your progress. And this is the front, which you can see. And here's the back. which is where we can really see the crosshatch pattern. And you will no doubt have had some success and maybe some hiccups, because nothing is ever perfect in life, and that's okay. I'm sure you did a fantastic job. One of the things that I wanted to show you, if you have not taken all your pins out, your whole quilt looks like this right here. Once you have seamed all the way around a whole block, that batting is stabilized with the top, with the quilt top and the backing. So at that point, you can take your pins out of the middle. And I find that very rewarding when I get to that place where I can start taking the pins out to get it out of the way. It feels better to handle it through the machine. It just gives me a sense of accomplishment. I may have mentioned before that I have a high need for accomplishment. So we have not done a lot of quilting on our quilt. You've no doubt seen the quilts that have very elaborate quilting. We need not do that on our very first, on your first quilt. But when you do have a lot of seams or stitches that come out to the edge, it will hold your fabric stable and to the back and so on and so forth. In this case, we really only have two rows of stitches per block, which leaves, give or take, about 4 inches. And we're going to soon trim this off, square it up, and then we're going to be working with some binding. And because of that, that's a lot of fabric that can wiggle in all of those processes, in both the trimming and the squaring up, which are not exactly the same thing, kind of, and then when we go to do the binding. So what I'm going to suggest to you, and what I have done on the remaining 3 sides before we came back, is to just do a whole row straight down the edge, slightly smaller than 1/4 inch in from the edge. And the reason for that is we're going to do our binding right along that edge. And if you do a full 1/4 inch seam allowance and your binding cheats in any from that 1/4 inch, you'll see your stitches. So what we're going to do is we're going to just cheat in just a little. So this very far edge of my walking foot is just about 1/4 inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, it's probably 1/16 of an inch, but just inside that, I'm actually looking through this little hole and I'm making sure that it's not going all the way to the edge. And so I'm just going to do that all the way down the length of the quilt, just like this. And so I'm not trying to accomplish anything. This is not going to be decorative. You won't even see this if we do this properly, because the binding is going to cover it up. This is just to stabilize that fabric so that as we do the process of trimming and binding, then our fabric will stay put and it won't crawl underneath what we're trying to do. Okay, so I am nearing the very end, and you can see where I have already done that stitch going the opposite direction. And I'm just going to cut that off right there. So for all intents and purposes, our quilting is done. Some of that fabric that we just stitched down may get cut away in the trimming process. So if you did kind of veer a little bit on the wide side of the 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's still fine. With this particular quilting pattern, just the one row of stitches on either side of the seam and having that crosshatch pattern on the back, it is not a lot of quilting. If you are a person who really likes that bumpy, ridgy, lots of texture. You can do additional stitches, and I want to show you what that might look like. This is my practice quilt. I actually trimmed it down, and I'm going to show you right here. This is the first row of stitches to the left of this seam, and then I came back and did another set of stitches down that same 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so I did that on both sides all the way around. So I did essentially 2 to the left and 2 to the right. And you can see that in this dark blue. If I turn it, you can see the other way. And let me hold that up. Now it's wrinkled because it's been folded. Hopefully, maybe if I get the angle right. So it's like a double crosshatch. And that gives it a little more interest, a little bit more texture. I could do a third on either side, and I could actually do the whole quilt that way if I was so inclined. I do want to mention that if you do that, the more stitching you do in your quilting, whether it's this or any other kind, the firmer the quilt is going to feel in the end. Imagine a mat that has lots of strips and stitches. It's just the stitches make it firmer. So it's going to be more textural and it's going to be more tactile. So if you're a person who likes to run your hand across those bumpy stitches, you can put as many stitches as you want. If you are a person who likes the drapey, soft, kind of cozy, then fewer stitches. And sometimes you have to split the difference. In our family, there's one of us that likes fewer stitches and there's one of us that likes lots of stitches. So you may have to split the difference depending on how you're using your quilt. But that is just a good rule of thumb. The more stitching you put, the firmer the end result will be, but the more tactile and the more textural, the fewer, the softer and cozier and more drapey. I think this sample quilt, I made all of the mistakes. I did rush it, and I think that I did a lot of mistakes. So maybe that's good for teaching purposes. Here is an example of doing, hopefully you can see that in the overhead shot. You can see I was not very straight with that edge stitch. And so over here, it's about 1/4 inch, and then it cheats into almost 1/16 of an inch. That's why I suggest that you do that edge stitch just literally right to the edge so that you don't have that. And here is an example of where the binding did actually cover up that stitch. So we're kind of going for this. Not this. All right. So that's a good example of that. My machine that I'm using for my quilting does not have this feature, but my domestic sewing machine does. So it is I don't actually know the name of it now that I think. If you know, when I describe this, if you know the name of it, tell me in the comments. I'm sure somebody will know the name of it. It's like, I would call it a walking foot extension, but it's a little pin that goes in your walking foot, and it can give you a guide for how to do things other than just that 1/4 inch. So I'm going to move my machine, this machine, bring up my domestic sewing machine and show you. Okay, so this is my just regular old domestic sewing machine that I had from the beginning. And I have a walking foot attached to it. And you may have seen this in your tools of things that came either with your walking foot or when your machine may have already had this. And you may have thought to yourself, what in the world is that? Well, let me show you. So I'm going to tip my machine a little bit. Back here in the back, there at the very back of my walking foot, where my pointer finger is right now, there's a little hole right next to where it says brother. And I'm going to just put that pin right there in that hole. And I can move it further in like this, or I can do it further out. And the purpose of this, and it is fantastic, is if you want to do a quilting stitch that's 1 inch off of your first stitch, then you can move this little pin and you will have a mark on your sewing machine that tells you where 1 inch is, or you can just judge it based on your fabric. All right, so let's say I wanted to use this seam right here, and I wanted whatever distance I chose. So this happens to be on the, it's like right at 1.5. So let me put it on the 1 mark. This becomes your guide. Isn't that smart? I love that. And so you just sew like you would, you just quilt like you would, and instead of trying to look at something on your walking foot or some other marker, that just like surfs along the surface of the fabric, and that becomes your guide. And you can do that 1 inch, you can do it more than 1 inch. It will go pretty good ways out. So if you wanted to put, for example, a seam right down the middle of this block, you could do that. And then you just use this little guy as the guide instead of your seam. And that will allow you to do, you can do 1 inch squares, you can do 2 inch squares. And so as you develop your quilting portfolio and you decide to do more than just these little seams on either side of the seam, you can use that. So I wanted to show that to you. It's very, very easy. If you've ever wondered what that was, it was so loud. That is the purpose of that little guy. So just know that's probably in your future if you want to keep quilting. So that's our quilting, and we're done with that part unless you decide to go back and put more stitches, which if you do, good for you. Make it your own. Absolutely make it your own. That's the most exciting part about quilting, and one of the reasons why I like to use men's dress shirts so much, because the quilt that I make isn't like anybody else's quilt, and yours won't be either. So this is just such a delight to help do this first quilt and help you make it unique and special. So if you want to go hog wild crazy and do 1/4 inch stitches all the way across your quilt, go do that and have fun with it. And we're going to come back next week and we're going to cover trimming your quilt. So we're going to cut away that extra batting and backing. And we are also going to get into making binding. So just like in our previous videos, I talk about what you'll need for next week. So for this coming up next video, you're going to need a cutting mat, your self-healing mat, a rotary cutter that you've already used, the rulers that you've used probably to cut your pieces. We're going to use those in trimming. And you'll need your 2.5 inch wide strips of fabric for your binding and matching thread for your binding, ideally 100% cotton. So those are the items that you're going to need. I do want to mention that we'll have a video how to square up your quilt, which will be a little bit more involved description of trimming away that backing and binding, and that might be helpful for you. Also, I have a video that I have already released called How to Cut Binding from a Men's Dress Shirt. So if the concept of binding is completely new to you and you're like, what do you mean 2.5 inch wide fabric? Watch that video and you will see what we need for next time, and you can go on and prep that and you'll be ready to go. So thanks so much for being with me. I hope you're enjoying this series. I've really enjoyed doing this, making this quilt, being here with you, and I hope that it's coming together the way that you want. And so I'm Kathy Martin, and this is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.